Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bronwyn Edwards. I'm the CEO of Roses in the Ocean, and I'm pleased to be with you here today to present the feedback loop number 2 for the co-design for the areas surrounding the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital in the Brisbane North PHN. So firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're all meeting today, pay our respects to ancestors and elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge all people with a lived experience of suicide. For those of you who've been part of this co-design process, thank you so much for bringing all your insights and perspectives and ideas to this process. Acknowledge that a number of clinicians also have a lived experience of suicide and that many others are impacted through suicide as they go about their line of work. So I'm just going to share my screen with you, and then we'll take you through the outcomes of the co-design, the last phase of the co-design process. So just to orientate you all as well to where we are in this process is you can see that we have conducted focus groups, both with people with lived experience of suicide and health professionals individually. We've had group lived experience session, we've had a group health professional session, the first feedback loop, live webinar and survey. And then we had a combined session for catchments 1 and 2 with lived experience people and health professionals. And then today, the feedback loop number 2 is following the combined session that we had last week with all the various stakeholders from the areas surrounding the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital. All right, so just to set the context again for you in terms of the guidance and principles that were provided by the Brisbane North PHN. We know that the sites will operate outside of normal business hours and that the PHN seeks to understand what days and times the service should operate and why. That the Brisbane North PHN currently hosts 3 mental health hubs in Caboolture, Strathpine and Barden. And that the co-design was seeking feedback on the proposal to locate safe spaces at these locations. Guiding principles, which you'll see will be added to later on, but the safe space hubs are a peer-led alternative to hospital emergency departments for those experiencing emotional distress and suicidal crisis. The safe space hubs will adopt appropriate use of peer workforce, offer clinical support, including on-call supports to ensure a warm and welcoming space and service where guests are supported. And that safe space hubs will take a no wrong door approach and seek to provide connections to services and the community. So when we talked more, continued the conversation about values, and the values identified in this combined session for the safe space hub: autonomy and self-determination, holistic, respect, emotionally safe, responsive, humanity, honesty and transparency, believability and credibility. So we continue to just refine those values as we come towards the end of this process. Now, a large portion of the combined session was actually spent workshopping a number of scenarios in small group discussions and then coming back together as a whole group to continue the conversation. So we're just going to take you through those now. Scenario 1, Chantel is a 17-year-old teenage girl who arrives at the safe space experiencing suicidal thoughts. It is the first time she's ever reached out for help, and she's frightened by what she's experiencing. She doesn't know where else to go. It's 8 p.m, just 30 minutes before closing time. The purpose of this scenario is to determine how people aged under 18 will be supported when seeking help through the Safe Space Hub, to determine how the local Safe Space Hub will manage supporting guests within organisational constraints, such as limited opening hours, and determine what the scope and nature of support is to guests beyond direct support within the Safe Space Hub. A few additional prompts were provided to people to help their conversations. Given the no wrong door approach required by the PHN, how will the local safe space support young people who turn up seeking help? Given that the Safe Space Hub can't be open 24/7, what processes could be developed to support guests seeking help near closing time? And what are some of the ways peer workers could provide support to guests outside of opening hours if needed? So you'll see here the responses to scenario 1 combined from 3 different groups. With regards to supporting guests near closing time, meet their basic needs. Option for relieving staff to come in to extend the opening hours, ensure they have somewhere safe to stay overnight, and make a plan for them to come back the next day when the Safe Space Hub is open next. Flexibility to extend Safe Space Hub hours on case-by-case basis. Funding available for emergency respite carers to find someone a safe place to stay overnight. Ask if a peer worker can call them later or the next day, ideally the same peer worker so they don't need to repeat their story. Offer them numbers to call overnight if needed. The Safe Space Hub has connections with emergency support workers and other support networks who can provide support after closing time. Safe Space Hub has connections with accommodation. Determine who can support them after the Safe Space Hub closes and offer practical assistance if needed. Support them to develop a safety plan. Provide a warm handover to another service, and look at other options like presenting to ED, calling Lifeline, acute care team or a GP. When looking at supporting young people specifically in the Safe Space Hub, welcome them into the Safe Space Hub, all ages welcome. Acknowledge this is the first time they're seeking help and validate them. Acknowledge they might have specific needs as a young person. Find out if someone knows where they are or if there is anyone they can tell. Ask them what kind of support they would like. Find out if they have any other supports or a trusted person, friends, family, neighbour, and if someone can come sit with them. Peer match with a young peer worker if possible. Ask questions to understand what is frightening them. Sit with them in their distress. Ask questions to understand protective factors like a pet, a job or friends. Scenario 2. Leanne walks into the Safe Space Hub. She knows the Safe Space well, having visited for a few weeks in a row. She had previously told a peer worker it's a place where she can relax for a while, knowing that she's safe from self-harming while she's there. Tonight, she appears to be intoxicated and is quite agitated that the peer worker who she now feels she can trust isn't available to talk with her. She's becoming quite loud and insistent, and another guest has indicated that it's making them feel uncomfortable. The purpose of this scenario is to determine how the Safe Space Hub will work with guests who appear to be intoxicated, how it will work with guests whose distress may express itself as aggression, and to explore ways that the peer workers will manage the competing needs of guests. A couple of additional prompts that were provided. The Safe Space Hub is intended to follow a no wrong door principle, and that there is not the exclusion criteria of traditional services. How will the Safe Space manage the issue of a potentially intoxicated guest? The Safe Space Hub will provide trauma-informed, compassionate support to everyone who attends. How will the Safe Space support a guest whose distress presents as aggression while keeping other guests safe? Now, in response to scenario 2, with regards to supporting guests who may be intoxicated, welcome them. No blanket rules against intoxication, but the Safe Space Hub has expectations for behaviour while in the space. Safe Space Hub has a space or a couch where they can sleep, meet their basic needs like food and water. Peer workers are trained in how to talk to someone who's intoxicated, sit with them and listen. Support would differ based on the level of intoxication, and come up with a plan for how to support them. When supporting guests displaying aggression, the responses were, let them know when the peer worker they know is next on shift and offer to talk to them in the meantime. Call the peer worker if possible and allow them to talk over the phone. Peer workers are skilled in de-escalation. Bring them into a private room. Someone sits with them and does not leave them alone. Specific sensory activities available for people who are angry, like exercise equipment, massage chair, a gliding chair. With regards to managing competing needs and the safety of guests, separate spaces are soundproofed. Separate them from other guests in a non-threatening and non-punitive way. Move other guests to a different area if moving the intoxicated guest is challenging. Guests can access an outdoor area. Escalation response as a last resort for safety concerns. And the escalation procedure is discreet. Procedure for keeping other guests safe, removing them from the space if needed. Supporting someone who comes in often, just some comments around that this shouldn't change the way that they are treated. This wouldn't be problematic unless they are spending all day, every day in the space. And if they are spending a lot of time in the space, they might need additional supports. So explore what's actually going on and work out ways to help through a long-term approach. Scenario 3, a young man who's been connected to the safe space from the Multicultural Services Organisation arrives at the Safe Space Hub. He is accompanied by a lady of similar age who he doesn't introduce. He appears a little agitated with the woman, but seems happy to have arrived at the safe space. He accepts a cup of tea from one of the staff, and while he's chatting quietly with them, he keeps glancing towards the woman. It's discovered she is his sister and is really keen to stay with him in the safe space and is clearly very concerned about her brother. The purpose of scenario 3 is to determine how the safe space will meet the young man's needs, determine the Safe Space Hub's approach to supporting carers and natural supports of people in crisis, determine how to identify and honour the wishes of the guests regarding the role of their carer or natural support in their crisis, and determine what other potential supports could be offered to carers or natural supports. Some additional prompts. What does culturally appropriate support look like? How will the safe space honour the no wrong door approach for culturally diverse backgrounds? How will the safe space respect the wishes of the guest while being compassionate of carer needs? Given that the primary purpose of the safe space is to support people in crisis, what can it offer by way of support to their carers' natural supports? So the group's response with regards to supporting guests who come in with a carer, ask them if they want their carer there, but recognise they may not be comfortable enough to respond truthfully. Important to understand guests' preferences for carer involvement and that they may change over time. Offer the option to have a private conversation. Separating them may cause anxiety, so need to be aware of that. Provide support in separate rooms and offer activities they can get involved in separately. Let the guest and the carer know their separate conversations will be confidential. It might be perceived that you're talking about them with the carer. It might be difficult to understand the dynamic between the guest and the carer, and ensure that the guest leads the conversation rather than the carer. Gain consent for the carer to be involved. Be transparent with both the guest and carer. And reflect the importance of working with the guest's natural supports. When it comes to supporting carers in the Safe Space Hub, offer separate support to the carer, including information about carer family supports, including social media groups. Peer match with a peer worker with a lived experience of being a carer, if possible. Carers are treated as guests who need their own support, and carers need to feel supported too. Ensure both the guest and carer's needs are being met. An individual approach to both the guest and the carer. Supporting guests in a culturally appropriate way, that the Safe Space Hub is welcoming of all cultures, that peer matching, if possible, ask them who they'd like to speak with, determine if they need an interpreter, and the Safe Space Hub has connections with interpreter service over the phone. Offer the same support offered to anyone, ask them what they need. Try to understand the carer's role from a cultural perspective, and don't make any assumptions about the carer's role and relationship with the guest. Ask for consent to speak with the service they were referred from to understand what is culturally appropriate. Overarching in this conversation are two things, I think. Firstly, that it's very important that carers are acknowledged and supported in their own right, and that they may have very different needs. Honouring the guest's wishes with regards to the carer, presence there on how they're involved, and that really do need to be making no assumptions at all with regards to somebody's cultural background and what their needs are, and that it needs to have that compassionate curiosity. Scenario 4, David turns up at the Safe Space Hub for the first time. He seems quite agitated and distracted. He had heard about the safe space from a community services worker who supports him in a program for people with complex and enduring mental illness. He tells the peer worker that his neighbour's trying to control his thoughts through a chip that he has planted in his television. David says he can't handle the torment of this anymore and feels that killing himself is the only way to get relief from it. The purpose of this scenario is to determine how the safe space approaches the support of guests who have been identified as having a serious mental illness, to determine how the safe space supports guests who identify as experiencing suicidal distress as a direct result of what clinicians would understand as symptoms associated with psychosis. Determine what non-clinical support looks like in the context of supporting guests with a diagnosis of serious mental illness. And a couple of extra prompts. How will peer workers support guests who are experiencing suicidal distress that appears to be associated with a serious mental illness? How will the peer workers support guests who disclose experiences like David within the space? Responses regarding supporting guests with a serious mental illness. Because of the referral, recognise the guest just needs some support. Otherwise, the worker probably would have escalated it. Important that no wrong door approach is present. Welcome them in and treat them the same as anyone else. There's an initial need to reduce distress. Sit with them in their distress, find out what support they want. Offer privacy and choice in where they sit, activities to get involved in. Help reduce distress and ask what they need and want. Acknowledge and validate their feelings and let them know you're not judging them. Important not to accuse them of having thoughts that aren't real. There's no need to agree with their thoughts, but understanding the fear is genuine. Don't debate or question their experience. No asking if they're seeing or hearing things that others don't. Don't assume it's psychosis. It may be psychosis-like. Find out who their other supports are and if they are accessing other services. Find out if they have experienced this before and what they've done to stay safe. Ask if something has changed recently to cause these thoughts. Once distress is reduced, help develop a plan for when they leave the Safe Space Hub. Determine if home is a safe environment for them or if they need accommodation for the night. Conversational assessment, protocol if someone is really unwell. With regards to peer workers have training in psychosis and serious mental illness, so they are prepared to just sit with them and be okay with what they're saying, as well as use appropriate language. It's important for peer workers to be able to just sit and help keep him safe, knowing they don't need to escalate it. Peer workers understand the guest is not a threat to them and know how to react in a way that's not damaging to the guest. Peer workers are aware of clinical supports available to connect the guest with. Acknowledge that peer workers are not there to treat the guests. Peer workers are trained in mental health first aid and know what to do and what not to do. Scenario 5. Amanda is a 20-year-old woman with a history of past suicide attempts who comes to the safe space extremely distressed. She says that her life is not worth living, that she has tried everything to stop feeling this way. She tells the peer worker that she has been on dozens of different medications, tried therapy for childhood trauma, done everything the psychologist told her, nothing ever works, and she's run out of options. When the worker asks her if she has plans to kill herself, she tells them that she has the means and is just waiting for her mum and dad to leave her alone. Her history of previous attempts is known to one of the safe space peer workers who had previously supported her in ED. So the purpose of scenario 5 is to determine how the local safe space will respond to guests who are characterised as at imminent risk of suicide. Determine how peer workers will support guests who are highly suicidal to ensure their safety, and determine what peer workers will need in order to support guests who are highly suicidal in an effective way. Some prompts for scenario 5. How will the local safe space support guests who are at imminent risk? How will peer workers work to ensure the safety of guests at high risk in a way that aligns with peer work values and principles and the locally identified safe space values and principles? And what are some of the ways peer workers can be supported to provide safe and effective support to guests at high risk of suicide? So in response to this scenario, with regards to supporting guests at imminent risk, validate their choice to come into the Safe Space Hub and treat them the same as anyone else. Ask if this is their first time at the safe space, and if so, acknowledge that they're trying something different and that coming to the Safe Space Hub is a strategy they can use, but it might take some time for it to help. Allow them to just sit and calm down. Recognise that they may have strategies they normally use but can't at the moment because they're too distressed. And just because something has worked in the past doesn't mean it will work now. Ask if they want to connect with a peer worker they know or someone that does not know them. Ask about their parents or other supports that they might have. Find out if their parents or other supports, or find out if their parents are actually supports or not. Sit with them for as long as is needed. Allow them to just sit, which may help them to feel calmer. Determine if they do have any supports who can be with them when they go home, or if we need to find them accommodation for the evening. Safety planning may be difficult at that time, but try to put a plan in place for the night. Identify protective factors. Don't send them home without connecting them to other supports. Ask what we can do to keep them safe and if there is anyone else who can come sit with them. And if time goes by and there's no change, determine whether an ambulance is needed. Also ensure other guests are safe and that the distress isn't putting anyone else at high risk. With regards to peer workers, the peer workers are able to just sit and hold that space with them from a non-medical perspective. That peer workers have access to a clinician with lived experience via phone if they feel they need extra support. Protocols for peer workers to determine if the guest needs extra help or medical attention without taking the guest's choice away. Peer workers are supported so they don't feel all the responsibility. And multiple peer workers on site, so multiple peer workers can sit with someone at imminent risk. Buddy system to provide support through the shift. Peer workers are trained to understand duty of care, and peer workers know their own boundaries and are comfortable bringing someone else in if needed. Through the discussions of the various scenarios, we then asked the group at the end of each scenario if there were any principles that were sort of falling out of those conversations that were really starting to shine through as being incredibly important to add to the actual principles of the safe space. And this is what was determined. So some draft principles, and obviously this needs some more work, some wordsmithing and some reduction in number, and often one or two can be combined. So at this stage, we operate under a no wrong door approach. We meet guests where they are at, offering individualised and flexible support. We provide an experience of safety and security. We aim to provide every guest with a sense of hope. We maintain the safety of every guest, carer and staff member. We operate in a culturally safe way and understand that every guest is different. We do not make assumptions about people. We treat the person, not the diagnosis. Our peer workers offer a range of experiences and are highly trained. We are transparent about what the Safe Space Hub offers. Every person who comes into the Safe Space Hub is treated as a guest. We value carers and understand the contribution they make and the distress they may experience. We acknowledge the whole person and see them in the context of their family, community and environment, recognising that they all play a role in a person's lived experience. We recognise that everyone has different needs and there is no such thing as too hard. So then it was time to just turn our focus to branding and communications. And we just asked the people at the very end of the day in the session to have a think about if they thought about what the Safe Space Hub, what they wanted it to feel like and look like, what the experience was to be, how would that then be reflected in their branding? So from a logo perspective, suggestion that the same logo should be used for all Safe Space Hubs. Soft colours like blues, greens, earth tones, mint green, that it should convey safe shelter, hope and connection. From a communication standpoint, that the Safe Space Hub ought to be well linked in and advertised through other services, advertised through social media and a website, well promoted so that people can find it, and advertised through billboards. In terms of branding, something subtle to indicate where the Safe Space Hub is, like a logo on the letterbox or a small sign. Needs to be accessible for people who don't have the ability to find something. Peer workers wear either a polo or a name badge so they're easily identifiable. Not aligned to organisations that are running the sites, and discreet but with signage. And finally, we asked everyone to consider what are their absolute non-negotiables for the Safe Space Hub? What absolutely are they not prepared to budge on? And this was the list that the group came up with. That it needs to have a security of funding, a commitment to the sustainability of the service. It needs to be accessible, versatile, physical space. that there are trained and highly supported workers with lived experience of suicide and understanding through shared experience. It welcomes and offers non-discriminatory, individualised support and safety to everyone. It doesn't send people away. Ongoing debriefing, supervision, support and professional development for the peer workers. The peer workers will have formal dialectical behaviour therapy. Aspire to everyone leaving with a sense of hope, positivity and capability, and well advertised and connected. So you'll see there are 5 there that are actually bolded, and they were the 5 that the group finally settled on as their 5 top non-negotiables. Okay, so next steps from here. The feedback survey will be released this afternoon or in the morning, and it will remain open until the 17th of October. So as always, please take the time to go back through that survey. All of these slides are there so you can really read them at your own pace. Add any additional thoughts that you've had if you've been involved in the process. If you haven't been involved, please, this is your opportunity to be so. So please circulate the links to the webinar and the survey amongst the other people within your network. So we really do want to have a lot more people with lived experience of suicide from this region, as well as health professionals and other stakeholders all contributing. So thank you all so much for your time, and we will look forward to seeing the results of this survey.